Welcome to Louisiana Heart Beats. I'm Sudie Landry, and with me today is an author that has written several books, and his name is Christopher J. Fontenot, author of historical fiction. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here.
Well, I started off with one book, Christopher. Now to find out you have how many books in this series?
Well, there's 2 written, one's at the publisher, and 2 more to go.
So this is not his first time at this rodeo. Notice the picture on the background, the Acadian prairie. That's what these books are about. He's got so much informative information. It's history. He's got genealogy. He's got facts of the Acadians coming and the trials and the story in between he's created. It is amazing that I told him this book needs to really be in resources everywhere, that the doors will open up for you. Now share with us what this picture is about and who drew it.
This picture is used for handbags that I wanted to have made to carry my books with. And my daughter, my oldest daughter, has a small business doing embroidery, and she found some pictures of old Acadian homes, sketched them together, and then she had it done on her machine.
And embroidery work is beautiful, and whenever I didn't understand that it had been embroidery. That is really amazing. Excuse me, later on we will be showing the different pictures of the different books that you have written. Now, let's start with the basics. What age did you start writing?
Started writing stories when I was about 10.
I like
sad
that
to
story.
say, I was punished in school, and I was assigned 5 pages to write. So I went to my grandmother's house and I sat down at her table and I started writing, and I realized I didn't want to write punish work. And I wasn't exactly positive that the old sisters would read everything I wrote anyway, so I wrote some stories instead.
What
And
a
she
kid.
never punished me for that, because apparently she didn't read.
You know, I've heard some stories, Christopher, but I have never heard of someone taking their punishment work and turning it into a brilliant story. Wow, that's the first for me. So you're right, she didn't read the story, so you didn't get punished.
No, I didn't get punished a second time. Once was enough.
Hey,
But after
okay.
that, I began to write other stories, and I continued to write all the way until I got to college.
So you were, again, how old at that time? Your
Well,
first
I was
writing?
starting at around the age of 10, and by the time I got to college, I had written about 10 or 12 stories, several hundred pages long, on legal-sized paper.
Wow.
But you know, Sudie, in those days, you had to use typewriters.
Yes, I used to use
Oh, yes.
typewriters. Yep, ding, 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 that's right. Share briefly what your childhood was like growing up.
Well, my father was an abstractor, and he spent a lot of his time in courthouses. And starting about the time I was 8 or 9 years old, we began to help him in his business. My mother and I would proofread some of the materials that he worked with. And when I got old enough to go on trips with them to the courthouses in Opelousas and Lafayette and St. Martinville and places like that, we would help him research the land titles. We did this for oil companies, so they would know who owned the land and who would get the royalty payments. I continued to do that all the way into college.
Well, that sure shows that you were a kid of high intelligence to be doing that kind of stuff. No wonder you know resources and you have a lot of it in your book. That's amazing.
It also helps to develop a love of the history, because when you do an abstract, you're basically writing the history of the land from
Wow.
the time that it was first granted, either by the King of France or the King of Spain, to the present day.
Well, going by the title of your book, The Acadiana Pride, and you have different names for the different books, it's really called, someone called it the Prairie series.
Right.
They kind of, toned it down. After teaching for 38 years, you had taught at different levels in the education field. Okay, but were you writing during this whole time your stories like you're writing now?
Not exactly. When I got to LSU as an undergrad, I actually took a course in novel writing. By that point, I had written several what you could call novels, my stories. And I wanted to see how I should be able to do it properly. And I was not very happy with my results because I was a terrible writer as
You
a child.
were?
I couldn't
Wow.
spell, I couldn't do anything. And I was lucky to get a B in the course. So I kind of put it aside. And by that point, school was getting a little harder, and I began to start teaching. I started teaching in the 7th grade.
Okay.
And then I was, at that point, I had a history degree. So at the end of the first year, because I was not certified, they had to let me go. And I went back to college to get certification in social sciences. It took me another year and a half. By that point, I didn't have time to write. I was just learning how to do
Yeah, you were
lessons, and
busy.
I was working. I was also coaching part-time, because you can't be a history teacher and not coach some sport. Schools like to double up and use all the skills. By that point, I started teaching back home, and I was teaching high school classes. I was teaching all kinds of courses. I was teaching computer literacy, computer science. I actually taught a chemistry class and a physics class and a speech class. And then I got into the histories, where I stayed for the next 23 years.
Okay.
Then at that point, I didn't have time. I was married. I was helping my wife raise children. We had 4 children. And then I transferred to schools in Baton Rouge for another 13 years, got a doctorate,
Wow.
and finished my education. And then at that point, Sudie, it was when I was working full time that I had to ask for half a day so I could get to work on my doctorate, my dissertation. When I finished my doctorate, I asked them to put me back to full time. They didn't.
Okay.
So I had all these afternoons free. And I had written my dissertation in a coffee shop. So it was a natural place to sit down with a laptop and just sit and write stories. And that was when I started doing that about 8 years ago, 7 years ago.
Those coffee shops are getting to work out these days because a lot of authors are out there sitting there drinking their coffee and writing their books and have told me that. So I'm not just saying just to say. Okay, so you did a whole lot. You taught, you helped raise your children, you had a family life, you had a life to help with the funds and the raising of the family. After retirement, you weren't retired. You started writing even more, like you just said, visiting those coffee shops or maybe finding a silent corner at your house. So when did you start writing the Acadian Prairie
Well,
series?
that's an interesting sub-story, if you want to call it that. I started writing stories about my college experiences. And I told my wife it was probably some kind of therapy
Oh,
to
okay.
get over all that angst and developing that you do when you're growing up. And I found that I enjoyed writing it. So I had to go back and edit out all the parts that were too personal.
Ah, you're right.
And it became fiction. But it was historically correct for the time. I did a little research. I found out what was going on at the time. And then while I was writing that story, I realized I'm talking about things that I did as a younger child. So I went backwards and wrote about my high school, and then my junior high experiences. And then I read a book, and I'm sorry I can't remember the name of the author, but she's here in Lafayette. And she wrote the story called Bel Air Cove,
Yes.
where she remembered her grandmother telling stories, and then she wrote a fictional account based on the life of her grandmother. And I remember reading that and finding it so interesting because the daughter who did that picture behind us lives in Bel Air Cove, probably
Wow.
not much more than 100 yards away from the homes of the people in the story. And I thought, well, if she can go back and talk about her grandparents, so can I. So taking the same characters, families, I went back 4 generations into the history of those families. Of course, the families are fictional, but the history of the time is correct.
Yes.
So I go back to the 1830s and I talk about the great-great-great-grandfather and his family and the neighbors, and they had to go through the struggles of living in the prairie when it was a prairie.
Yeah.
There were no fence lines in those days. They were cattlemen. and the cattle just roamed free. And it was sort of like the same thing you read about or you see on television in Texas, the big cattle drives.
Right.
And then I began to develop the same families, following the same families as they grew up in the Acadian prairie. The first book, Todul, covers the time period from 1830s, the Texas Revolution. One of the children is killed in the Texas Revolt, all the way through the end of the Civil War.
Okay, and that's 1830s. Okay, there's the other books, a little glimpse into them on the second book.
The second book, Mayus, follows the only surviving son of Todul and continues his life from 1877 to 1890s.
Okay, and then we have a third book that takes you all the way up to the 1960s.
Well,
What?
the entire series goes that far.
Okay.
The third book, which is at the publisher now,
Oh, it's at the publisher
and
now.
we
Okay.
are going to be working on it for the next 6 or 7 months, getting it edited and prepared, follows the daughter of Mayus and covers the time period from 1894 to about 1901. And my working title was is Amélie, the courtship of Amélie Dupré. And it talks about the times, it talks about the families. And then the fourth book will be the story of her brother, Octave. And it'll cover the same basic time, 1894, but it will go all the way to 1920. And it will, the end of the book concerns the great fire in Ville Platte that killed 28 people in a dance hall.
Uh-oh. Okay. Wow.
And that fire made news all the way from Los Angeles to New York.
My goodness. Okay, well, number one, let's ask, okay, where are you originally from and where do you reside now?
I reside about a half mile, actually,
know.
from where my father had a farm. When the oil business went down in the 60s, we moved from Ville Platte, which is the northern corner of the Acadian Prairie, down into the area that is now called Point Blue.
Okay.
But my mother was from Point Blue. In fact, her childhood house is about 200 yards from the house that I was raised in. And my father was from Chautauqua. Chautauqua is a small village, but I think it's probably the second or third oldest village in Evangeline Parish. The earliest families are traced back to the 1890s. Oh, so I'm sorry, 1790s in that
1790s,
area.
yeah. Okay, share what it was like as told to you by your father, how he lived. Share some of his life.
Oh, my father was raised in Chautauqua when you had to walk just about everywhere.
Yes.
It was kind of off the beaten track. And later on, after he was born, I'm sorry, actually it happened before he was born, the village of Chautauqua had to move. There's an interesting problem that they had. In the 1880s, the Dusson brothers built the village of Crowley. And they literally created it out of farmland, put some streets down, sold lots, and made a lot of money. Well, 10 years later, 1890s, 1896, somewhere around there, they bought it's 160 acres of land, laid out the streets, and convinced a railroad company to build a railroad track from Crowley north and established the town of Eunice.
Wow.
And then 10 years later, they built Mamou the same way. Now, in 1908, they were planning to build a connecting line between Crowley and Bunkie. So the railroad company began to lay tracks out through Eunice, towards Ville Platte, beyond to Bunkie. Chautauqua sent a delegation down to try to get them to put the tracks through Chautauqua. And the railroad company said, no, that will be too far out of our way. So in 1908, the railroad came through, and everybody in Chautauqua packed up, moved house, barns, everything 1 mile further west
Wow.
to establish the village on the railroad track where they could put their cotton gins and their warehouses and their stores where the railroad would pass, and they could stop the trains and put people on and off and load and unload goods.
Well, I was told a lot of stories when I first moved here 50 years ago, and that one I missed, or they didn't tell me. It's amazing because I can relate to everything that you're saying because I'm married into the Cajun culture, and as I was sharing with you earlier, everything from cannot speak any English to being barefoot to getting in trouble if you did speak French at school and things like that. That's the stories I heard. And of course the big storms, that came and, did away with a lot of land. And I never was interested in history until I got married and married somebody with all the history I needed to know about. So backing up, as a transplant, not knowing any of this and falling in love with the culture and the food, there's a lot of stuff I always wondered why, and still I'd like to ask you again, I mentioned it earlier, why did the Cajuns have so much trouble finding a place to settle, really, without all the, why were they not accepted so easily? Was there a reason? Other than the times that they were in?
That's an interesting question because the Acadians, the people from our area in South Louisiana aren't all Acadians.
I know, and that's the part that confuses me.
In the early 1800s, 1700s, a lot of Frenchmen moved to Canada. Mm-hmm. And then the English and the French fought a series of wars, and the English won all of them. And every time they won a battle or they won a war, they got some land from the French. And in this particular case, in the 1700s, the people who lived in Acadia, which is in the eastern coast of Canada,
okay,
were considered to be threats to the safety of the British in North America, and they were required to take an oath of allegiance to the King of England.
Oh, okay.
And that led to what is called, the French call it the Grand Arrangement, or the Acadian exile, where by order of the king, all the people of that area were forced out of their homes. Their homes were burned, the barns were burned, the fields were destroyed. And these people were packed onto ships without any regard to family or relatives.
Yes.
They're shipped all over Europe and all the way up and down the East Coast. Many of them wound up back in France, but they had no homes, they had no resources whatsoever. Everything had been destroyed by the English. So starting in the 1760s, right after the French and Indian War, they began to get clued that they could move to land that had been granted to the Spanish, which was what is now called Louisiana. So they began to filter in. Now that's the Acadians. And a lot of them settled along the Mississippi River in New Orleans and scattered along the bayous, and some of them made it all the way to the prairies. At the same time, the French people who had come in and found homes in what is now Alabama, which at the point was a French possession, they were required to leave by virtue of the French and Indian War Treaty. My ancestors, the Fontenots, one of them arrived around the age of 20.
Okay.
Settled in Des Alabama, which is a settlement along a river in Alabama, the Alabama River, at a Fort Toulouse.
Wow.
Now, he got married when he was 40, and the treaty forced them to abandon the fort, so he packed up his family, his wife, and eventually 14 children, and they moved west. The daughters apparently all got married off along the Mississippi River. But 5 of the sons moved to Grand Prairie, just east of Opelousas. And from there, they continued the tradition of getting married young and having 14 children, who had 12 children, who each had 10 children, and scattered
family units, for sure.
Family units out into the prairie, and they were cattlemen.
Okay. Now, okay, sir, Spanish Louisiana, why was that called Spanish Louisiana? I read it somewhere in your book, in the back part. There was something was known as Spanish Louisiana. Was it a certain part of the town, or?
No, what happened was at the end of the French and Indian War,
Right.
Spain came in toward the end of the war and picked the wrong side. They came in with the
Okay.
French. The French were expelled completely from North America.
Okay.
They kept a couple of islands up in the northern part of the Atlantic coastal region. They kept a couple of islands in the Caribbean. And all their territories west of the Mississippi River were granted to Spain in compensation.
Okay.
So what used to be French Louisiana
Okay.
became Spanish Louisiana.
That's what got me a little bit on, like, there's a difference there.
And the Spanish realized the area was empty and needed to be filled up, so they began to offer anyone who wanted to come into the area on basically just a few small considerations. You had to become members of the Spanish, they had to swear allegiance to Spain. They had to remain Catholic, which fit the French perfectly. And they began to accept people, and this is where the Acadians began to filter in, because they were actually invited in. Many of them came to Haiti, and then from there to New Orleans. And to get away from the politics and the wars and everything, they scattered west into the prairies and along the bayous, where they thought they could be left alone.
And they wanted to do their own life, take care of their own family.
That's right.
And all that. Well, we're actually 4 minutes from ending the show. I want to go ahead and go to the book and books. What was your reason for even writing this book and these books? Explain the title, Why Prairie, which you did earlier. As you can see, as we can see, viewing audience, it's not just one book that he has written. So briefly tell us what each book is about, again, which you brought up earlier when we were talking.
Right. The first novel in the series is a story about Tudul. He's a Dupré, and it follows the Duprés, the Ortigos, the Frugés, and several other families, including a family of, at the time of the Civil War, they were slaves. But one daughter was apparently was mistreated by one of the overseers,
Right.
and she had a child. She ran away. In the story, this is all fiction. It's,
Right.
I'm not describing any person who was actually alive. I
Right.
didn't want to insult any families, but
Fiction
a lot of
based
these
on
things
facts.
happened so that the child born was raised by Indian healer
Okay.
and trained to be a traitus,
Okay.
a healer.
A healer.
And that shows up in Tudul. In the next generation, Tudul's family is pretty much decimated by disease, and only one survivor lived to adulthood. And he married the only survivor of the Ortigo family, who had become rivals of the Duprés.
Okay.
So in a sense, it's sort of like Romeo and Juliet, where both families were a little upset.
Well, you sure have a lot. And also, let's talk about those extras that you have after the story's over in each book. Resources, language definitions.
No,
You even
that
shared
comes-
where you got the resources from.
You don't go through a doctorate program
Wow.
and not learn how to keep track of your resources. And I had to do a lot of research because there was a lot about the Acadians that I didn't understand and wanted to understand. And I found some resources that were not available anywhere else. In fact, when I went back to try to find them again, to list them in my resources, I couldn't find them. They had disappeared from the internet. So I listed what I used to resource my stories in a bibliography. And there were also a lot of common things that in the northern prairie, they don't always pronounce everything the same way as they do in the southern prairie or in the bayou regions. And it's Cajun French, not French, not Parisian French. So I included a list of terms that were used in the stories as people spoke, so that you could go back and see what it actually meant when they said those things.
Well, Christopher, and I'm telling you, Acadiana, that section of the book has more than one or two words and definitions. You could almost just make a little extra book on just the language, but we really appreciate what you put there. And the rolling credits will be coming up soon. So, have you got a book signing coming up anytime soon?
I
If so,
I
just
haven't
where?
had anything scheduled, but there were several bookstores and local stores have asked about it. So at some point or other, there will be.
Okay, and if anyone would like to get in contact with you and find out where your signings are going to be, they can always go back to that email or shoot me an email or even call AOC and see.
And you can look on Facebook. I just recently opened up a Facebook page called the Acadian Prairie.
Well, then that's what you need to do. Remember, the Acadian Prairie. Well, I'm glad that was information that was not for me now, but it is. I'm glad that you shared it. Well, I want to thank Acadiana and Facebook for tuning in. So hopefully he has given you an insight just how educational and interesting these books can be. So tune in. Who knows, it might be you we are featuring next. But meanwhile, Christopher J. Fontenot, he is the author in historical fiction of several books. Keep an eye out for him.
Thank you very much. Wow.